The Indian paradigm for strategic interaction. If you recall, it is chess, which originated supposedly in India, Shatranj and so on and so forth, originated in India. It's a linear game, strategic game, action, reaction, right? Someone makes a move, you make a counter move. Someone makes another move, you make a counter move. It's a linear game. You depend on the other player to respond to you, and he then waits for you to respond to him. It's a linear game. That's how we play it. We think that the strategic craft that the Chinese and adversaries follow is this linear game that we respond, they react, we react, and counter react, move, counter move. That's not how the Chinese look at their stagecraft. Their game, ancient, described in Analects of Confucius, integral to the strategies articulated by Sun Tzu, is something called Waiki. Waiki, if I would simplify it, is a chessboard with all kinds of squares. And the game is to see who occupies most of the board, not who takes down the queen. Who occupies, at the end of the game, occupies most of the squares on the board. Look how beautifully Chinese have gone about doing it since 1949. They have co-opted all the states on their periphery with economic incentives. They have got them to plug into the Chinese economy. So much so that even Vietnam, its most, shall we say, its most aggressive, I wouldn't call it competitor or rival, but someone which aggressively defends its interests. The only country, if I may say so, on Chinese periphery that is willing to aggressively defend its interests is Vietnam. And yet Vietnam has been co-opted. Vietnam doesn't know how aggressively to defend its interests, considering that almost 25% of its economy now depends on the Chinese economy. See how beautifully they've done it. All of Laos is virtually a Chinese colony. They'll do whatever China wants. Cambodia is virtually in the same state. My point is that we do not recognize how China is occupying, not in the simple terms of encirclement and counter-encirclement, moves and counter moves, but in this larger chessboard or Waiki board of occupying space, whereas China has pretty much occupied most of the critical spaces in the Indian Ocean. We know, whether it's Maldives, whether it's Sri Lanka, whether it's Pakistan, whether it is Burma, whether it's Bangladesh, to which China supplies 70% of its military wherewithal. So it has contained India by these means. And meta-strategically, if I may speak in that aspect, they deliberately nuclear missile armed Pakistan with great forethought and strategic insight, because they knew that if you nuclearize Pakistan, India would have to be preoccupied with Pakistan, and that's it. And this gelled and meshed in very nicely with the Pakistan's own notion of itself. Because Pakistan, curiously, are also legatees of the same Kautilya and Chanakya that we are. And the curious thing that I find is that Pakistanis, again, our notions of how we react with our neighbors, with distant states, is animated by the notion of mandala, which is described in Chanakya's Arthashastra. The mandala is again a simplistic, if I may say so, paradigm, geometric paradigm of concentric circles, where the countries next to you, in the circle next to you, are enemies. The countries beyond in this circle thereafter are friends, and so on and so forth. It's a geometric, deterministic notion of who adversaries are and who our friends are. But actually, that's not how the world is. That's not how the world is. Unfortunately, as I said, so much of our thinking, even present day thinking, is rooted in such notions, which are deep down in our consciousness. For instance, why else would we not have good relations with any of our neighbors? Isn't it true? Is there any single neighbor that we have good relations with? We have to think. It's precisely what's exploited by China. Because their notion does not comport with ours. Their notion, as I said, is to occupy space and to build up a coherent kind of pattern of states, friendly states around, which also have resources. So if you project even further geographically, you'll find China having natural resources in Africa, in Latin America, preempting India in many respects. But forget India, they are preempting Russia in some respect. They have preempted America in natural resources, in Latin America, in the American sphere of influence. So forget India. These guys are thinking so ahead that they are capturing and buying off sources of natural resources. You know, they're bought off governments. In Angola, for instance, they're virtually bought off governments. The Central African Republic, Democratic Republic of Congo, is in hock to Beijing. And there they mine nickel, copper. If you look at Tibet from that point of view, look at what we have lost in Tibet. One of the largest uranium reserves, one of the largest rare earths reserves, rare earth or rare metals reserves in the world are found in Tibet. There is something radically wrong with our way of thinking. Now, what is one to do with, Pakistan, as far as I have always said, has succeeded enormously well, haven't they, in reducing India to their size? Because when you make another country your prime concern, that means you elevate them to the status of prime adversary, which falls in nicely with the Pakistanis' own notion of themselves as a big country, isn't it? So haven't we fallen into the trap of reducing ourselves to Pakistan's size, militarily and otherwise? This is the problem. Nehru never understood. While Nehru talked about being the third bloc and trying to be the balancing bloc of third world nations between the two great superpowers, Pakistan, for instance, had a very limited notion of itself. And Liaquat Ali Khan talked about Pakistan as the center of Asia, the heart of Asia. He called it the heart of Asia. Geostrategically, that's absolutely correct. Look at how Pakistan is now the frontline state for adversarial encampments that work against India's interests. By that I mean Western, the US, maybe, the point is we may, in value terms and democratic terms and this, that and the other, resonate with their interests, but our interests do not converge with the American interests in any way. In fact, they diverge. There's a inherent clash of interests with America, and yet very few recognize this. Most obvious fact. And therefore, Pakistan is a frontline state for the Americans because of Afghanistan. Is that not right? Because it fronted on Russia, and they had to therefore encamp themselves in Pakistan to deal with Afghanistan and Central Asia, Russian Central Asia in the Cold War. They still remain the frontline state because of Afghanistan. For the Chinese, Pakistan are also a frontline state to contain India. It is how, with very minimal attributes, Pakistan has been able to maximize its leverage. It has to be appreciated. It has to be appreciated with how little they have been able to achieve so much. If nothing else, as a nuisance, there's a great value to being a nuisance in international politics. There's a great value, strategic value to being a nuisance. Pakistan, I always maintained, is not a threat. Can never be a threat to India. Can never be a threat to India. But it can be an enormous strategic nuisance. And that's what I say to my military audiences. Please make a distinction between a nuisance and a threat. And accordingly build up your capabilities. But you're reversing the entire thing. The main challenge is there going unaddressed while you deal with a minor foe that is in no way your equal, in no way may seek parity, but has no way can achieve it. Why is it not in the least a threat? Pakistan, let me very bluntly, the budget, the entire budget of Pakistan, the entire annual budget of Pakistan is less than the Indian defense budget. India occupies 72% of the land mass in South Asia. It produces more than 2/3 of the wealth in South Asia. There is extraordinary potential for India to co-opt Pakistan despite the Pakistan army. That's been the case I've been making for years together. In the main because the Chinese Pakistan army, despite what Parvez Musharraf might say now, you see his extraordinary attitude, wherein he says, oh, India shouldn't provoke Pakistan, as if, Pakistan can do something very drastic against India. But the fact is that he talks that way. The attitude is remarkable for a country that is so little. The point, I think, is this, and some of you may have read Aisha Siddiqa's book called Military Incorporated. And it shows how Pakistan army, for obvious reasons of sustenance, which they know, look, they monopolize the national budget, but they also are aware that the national budget does not really provide them all the resources. It's not that big an economy, so naturally they cannot tap the resources all that much. And therefore they have to have their own means of sustenance, which they have, because Pakistan Army Pakistan Army owned factories and firms produce 3 to 5% of Pakistan's GDP. Isn't this extraordinary? Pakistan Army owned cement factories, fertilizer factories, sugar factories, transport companies, tire retailers, all owned by the Pakistan Army. Do you think such an army with such financial interests would be able to fight a war in which they could lose all these financial bases of support? Would they imperil that? Something to think. And shouldn't we then encourage this very aspect and try to co-opt them? Instead, we alienate them even more, and you have the kind of attitudes that we have. Carry on in the old Cotilian tradition of using the 4 instruments in diplomacy. Sama, Bheda, Dand, and what's the 4th one? Dhamma. Now, the Dhan, Sam. Okay. Now, okay. The point, I think, is that we haven't been able to use any of these except the Dand. And that has limited returns. You have pretty much optimized your returns on the Dand. You have really done it. Now that they have got the nuclear power weapons, they think that they can neutralize you, that you'll never go to war, which is actually true. When I was on the National Security Advisory Board, and we were drafting the nuclear doctrine and so on, and this is some of the stuff that I did in graduate work in California. We did the war gaming, nuclear war gaming, and what we discovered was that if there was actually a nuclear exchange, let's say there was actually a nuclear war between India and Pakistan, not a war, an exchange. War is something very different. We may lose two cities. It's true. They may get across, and we may lose two cities, Delhi and Bombay, most likely. Madras is safe, so. So, but in exchange for two cities, and here I think the military people here would appreciate the exchange ratio, what they call the exchange ratio, the ratio of destruction that you suffer vis-a-vis the destruction that you can impact on the adversary, is so disproportionate. For the two cities, Pakistan will be completely destroyed as a social organism, meaning it will cease to exist as a social organism. When I go to Pakistan, and I said this to Pakistani military audiences, because there was some nuclear signaling going on, and I was part of, I was used for such purposes. I'm used, and I go there and I talk. And when I say this to the military people there, generals, an audience of generals and admirals and air marshals and so on, they entirely understand what I'm saying. No one contests that. They don't put, we are, you Hindus are baniyad, or, we are 5 times as strong, and each one of us will take on 7 people and kill you. They don't do that. They understand what I say. When I say the exchange ratio, oh God, forgive me. They understand fully when I say what the consequence will be of the nuclear wire being tripped. And therefore, they will never cross the nuclear Rubicon, no matter what the provocation. No matter what the provocation. But it is the thing that we are very exercised about in Delhi. Oh, I've argued that you can virtually denude our entire western border of all forces and nothing is going to happen. What is Pakistan going to do? Take over Rajasthan? My point is that we have to have a more realistic notions of what our enemies are capable of, which we don't seem to have. Our militaries, it helps them to get the funding when they talk of Pakistan. When they talk of China, there's no funding. Isn't this remarkable? And isn't it ironic? And it illustrates exactly the problems India faces where national security is concerned. That your major adversary, the one that ties you up in knots, that exploits your weaknesses, that has exploited your situation, goes scot-free. While the one country that can do you no harm, no matter how much it wishes to do you harm, is the one that we get worried and worked up about and want to blow to smithereens. There's something wrong. There's something wrong here in our assessment, in our basic constructs of security. What I've been saying is, for China you have to deal, as we have to deal with Pakistan, with all countries, on the basis, certainly China will respect you more had we responded to their nuclear weaponization, which they started in 1978. Had we responded by nuclear weaponizing Vietnam, we should have responded in kind and immediately. That would have sent the Chinese a message that you cannot do these kinds of things without suffering, like consequences. Consider what would have happened had we had the gumption and the guts to nuclear weaponize Vietnam. I've been pleading for our BrahMos supersonic cruise missiles to be given to Vietnam. For the last 15 years, I've been advocating it. There was a visit by the Vietnamese defense minister some 6, 7 years back. And fortuitously, the day he arrived in Delhi, there was an op-ed by me. I mean, who reads books anymore? So my books are worse than useless. But everybody or some people have time for reading op-eds, just 1,500 words. So I'd said in that op-ed that we should give what Vietnam wants. And what they wanted was BrahMos missile as a deterrent against China. I said, give them the nuclear-armed BrahMos. We have the nuclear-armed BrahMos missiles. Let's see how China begins to sweat. Make them sweat. Make them consider their own security situation that becomes very untenable when Vietnam has a nuclear weapon. And why is that important? Look at Vietnam's. This is Vietnam here, right? This is Hainan. This is the Hainan port, which is the base for the South Seas Fleet, the most powerful Chinese fleet in the Chinese Navy, which is the most powerful arm, is going to become the most powerful arm in the People's Liberation Army Navy, as they call it. I don't know what the nomenclature is, but PLA, Navy, PLA, Air Force, and so on. So if you, the Vietnamese have given us a base on the central Vietnamese coast at Nha Trang. They've given us a naval base. We have an electronic listening post there. We can read the ELINT, electronic intelligence on Hainan. So the electronic traffic going in through Hainan, which is a main military base, we read it. They're given us. Now if China, the Vietnamese were to be equipped with nuclear BrahMos missiles, what will it do? It'll have the results that the Chinese have when they have nuclear-armed Pakistan. It has contained India. This will contain China's naval fleet to the Hainan Island. They will not be able to move out for fear that the ships are going to be blown out of the water. And we shouldn't let it be known as to which of the BrahMos is nuclear warheaded and which is conventional warheaded. Let them guess. They'll never know what's going to hit them. And mind you, the Vietnamese are extraordinarily strong and nationalistic. They are the only country on China's periphery, as I've said, that has aggressively defended its territory. In 1979, again, when Vajpayee, as the External Affairs Minister, went to Hanoi in 1979, February or March of 1979, on the day he arrived in Hanoi, China launched its attack on Vietnam as a signal to India. That's the signaling they do. Xi Jinping comes here, the PLA comes into Chumar. That is the pattern. They drive home the signal, the message.